On a January morning in 1923, in the garden of the house where she had grown up, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon finally said yes. 2 years. 2 refusals. And then something shifted, in her thinking, in her reading of the future, in her understanding of what the woman she was becoming actually required in order to become fully herself. She looked at this shy, dutiful, stammering prince who had refused to stop asking. And she decided. She could not have known, not entirely, not yet, what she was deciding. She could not have known that the brother everyone was watching was already carrying the seed of the crisis that would destroy him. She could not have known that the throne no one had designed for her husband was, within 13 years, going to need him. She could not have known that the nation she was about to join was going to face the darkest years in living memory, and that her particular combination of warmth and iron would become one of the things that held it together. She said yes to a duke. She would end up a queen. And the distance between those two things would cost more than either of them imagined on that January morning in the garden. Welcome to the final episode of The Woman Behind the Smile, here on Chronicles of the Crown. Subscribe if you have not already. Because this is where everything that came before finally makes sense. She had turned him down in 1921. She had turned him down again in 1922. The reasons she gave were consistent and, by all surviving accounts, sincere. She did not want to enter royal life. The British monarchy was not a position of decorative dignity. It was a life sentence of public exposure, every word examined, every expression catalogued, every private feeling required to remain private regardless of what was actually happening inside. It was a life in which one's time, one's movements, one's relationships, and even one's grief would belong not to oneself but to the institution. She had grown up near that world. She understood its demands more clearly than most people standing outside it. And she was honest enough with herself, which was one of her most underrated qualities, to admit that she was not certain she wanted to live inside it. But Bertie had persisted. Quietly, consistently, without drama or ultimatum. He had made clear through every available channel that his decision was made and his feelings were not going to change. He had enlisted allies carefully. His mother, Queen Mary, was reportedly sympathetic, which in the architecture of the royal family was not a small thing. Elizabeth was paying attention. She always paid attention. She was also watching the wider landscape with the careful, assessing eyes that her upbringing had trained to miss nothing. The 1920s were not a stable decade for European monarchies. The war had dismantled several of them outright. The Russian, German, and Austro-Hungarian empires had collapsed entirely, their royal families dispersed or destroyed. The British monarchy had survived. But survival and security are not the same thing. The institution needed people who could perform its public function with genuine human warmth, not just dignity, but connection. Not just presence, but feeling. Elizabeth looked at Bertie. She looked at his shyness, his stammer, his fundamental decency, his stubborn refusal to stop asking. And she looked at herself. At what she could do. At what she had always been able to do, walk into rooms and make them warmer, manage atmospheres that others found unmanageable, offer comfort with an ease that looked like instinct but was built on years of disciplined practice. The man beside her was going to need exactly that. Whether on a modest public stage or, though she could not know this yet, on the largest stage in the world. In January of 1923, at St. Paul's Waldenbury, he asked her a third time. She said yes. Her own description of the moment was characteristically understated. She spoke of a certainty arriving suddenly, not like a calculation completing itself, but like a recognition. As though she had not decided so much as finally admitted what she had already known. Perhaps that is exactly what happened. Perhaps after 2 years of declining, she simply knew. Or perhaps she had always known, and had been waiting, with the patience that was one of her most powerful and least visible qualities, until she was certain enough to commit without reservation. On the 26th of April, 1923, at Westminster Abbey, before a watching nation and a royal family that was quietly, collectively relieved, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon married Prince Albert, Duke of York. She was 22 years old. He was 27. The life she had spent her entire existence preparing for, without ever quite knowing that was what she was doing, had begun. The early years of the marriage were, by royal standards, relatively sheltered. Bertie was the Duke of York. Second in line to the throne. Important enough for significant ceremonial duties. But not the heir. Not the one on whom the weight of everything depended. That was Edward. And as long as Edward remained, as he presumably would, for decades, Bertie and Elizabeth could build something approaching a private life within their public obligations. They were, by all accounts that survived the careful filtering of royal discretion, genuinely happy. Princess Elizabeth, the future Queen Elizabeth II, was born in April of 1926. Princess Margaret arrived in August of 1930. The family settled into a life that was royal in its structure and relatively human in its texture. They were a real family. Not a performed one. Elizabeth took to royal life with a facility that confirmed everything her friends had predicted and exceeded what even her admirers had hoped. The concerns she had voiced in her earlier refusals were real. The life was demanding, rigid, and unforgiving of private feeling. But she had prepared for it more thoroughly than anyone outside her own head knew. And she brought to it exactly the skills it required. She was warm in public when warmth was needed. Composed in formal settings when formality was required. She dressed with the precise, instinctive understanding of someone who knows that royal clothing is not self-expression but communication, that what a duchess wears to a hospital ward or a factory floor or a state dinner is a message, and the message must always be exactly right. But her most important work was invisible. Bertie's stammer had not improved simply because his circumstances had changed. Royal life offered no relief from the speaking engagements that exposed it most brutally. Every public occasion was a test. Every speech was an ordeal. Every moment that required him to open his mouth in front of a watching crowd cost him something that the crowd could not see and would not have imagined. Elizabeth understood this. She had learned, over the years of courtship and early marriage, how to create the conditions in which he could succeed. How to manage the atmosphere of a room before he entered it. How to absorb the social energy of an occasion so that he could focus on the specific thing he needed to do. How to be present beside him in a way that steadied him without diminishing him. Without making him appear to need steadying. That distinction, being his support without becoming his crutch, was one of the most difficult and most important things she ever did. And she did it invisibly, consistently, for the rest of his life. They would eventually find Lionel Logue, the unconventional Australian speech therapist whose work with Bertie became one of the more remarkable stories of the era. But the ground in which that work could take root, the belief that improvement was possible, the emotional stability that made sustained effort survivable, was built largely by Elizabeth. She gave him somewhere solid to stand. In a life that offered very little solid ground, that was not a small gift. It was, in fact, everything. In 1936, the architecture of their lives collapsed without warning. King George V died in January. He was 70 years old and had reigned for just over 25 years. His death was not unexpected. But what followed it was something that none of them, not Bertie, not Elizabeth, not the government, not the watching world, had fully prepared for. Edward VIII took the throne. For a few months, it seemed like the future everyone had imagined. The handsome, modern, adored prince, the one the crowds had followed for 2 decades, finally occupied the position he had been born for. The 1920s generation watched their prince become their king and felt the particular satisfaction of the world arriving exactly where they had always expected it to be. It lasted less than a year. Edward's determination to marry Wallis Simpson, an American woman, twice divorced, whose relationship with the requirements of the Church of England was constitutionally impossible, created a crisis that the government, the Commonwealth, and the royal family could not absorb. The Prime Minister was unambiguous. The Church of England, of which the monarch was the formal head, could not sanction what Edward was asking it to sanction. Edward chose Mrs. Simpson. On the 11th of December, 1936, he abdicated. He broadcast the decision to the nation in a speech heard by millions, explaining that he could not carry the burden of royal responsibility without the woman he loved. As rhetoric, it was genuinely moving. As a dereliction of the duty he had been born for, trained for, and trusted with, it was genuinely devastating. And it left the throne empty. The man who had to fill it was Bertie. The shy one. The dutiful one. The one who had never been trained for this specific and crushing weight. The one whose public life had always felt like punishment. The one who had been standing quietly in the background of the story, supporting his brother, performing his duties, building a private happiness in the modest shelter of his secondary position, for his entire adult life. He became King George VI on the day his brother signed the abdication instrument. He was 40 years old. He was not ready. He knew, with complete and painful clarity, that he was not ready. And he had the particular kind of courage, rarer than battlefield courage, less visible and therefore more costly, to accept the role anyway. Elizabeth was now queen. Not duchess. Not princess. Queen consort. First lady of the nation. The woman beside the men on whom, in the years that were coming, absolutely everything would depend. She had not planned this. She had said so, in various ways, across the years of her earlier refusals and her careful, finally committed acceptance. She had not married a future king. She had married the man who was specifically, deliberately, structurally not supposed to be one. But she had spent her entire life, in the nurseries of Glamis, in the wartime corridors lined with wounded men, in the drawing rooms of the London season, in the years of quiet and essential partnership with a man who needed her more than he could say, she had spent all of it becoming exactly the woman that this moment required. She did not flinch. She did not hesitate. She did not perform courage because she did not need to. She simply stepped forward. That was always, in the end, what she did. What came next was the war. The bombs. The nights underground. The mornings walking through rubble in good shoes and pearls, speaking to people who had lost everything, homes, children, entire streets where their lives had been built, and somehow, impossibly, making them feel that something still held. That something was still standing. She refused evacuation. She refused safety. She stood in the bombed streets of London when every calculation of personal security said she should not. And she smiled, not the empty, performed smile of someone going through a required motion, but the real, warm, utterly undefeated smile of a woman who had decided, a very long time ago, that composure was a gift you gave to other people when they needed it most. The nation loved her for it. They still do. But now you know something the simple love story does not include. You know where that smile was made. In a Scottish castle. In wartime corridors. In the patient, strategic, iron-willed years of a woman who understood herself completely, who knew what she was worth, what she could do, and what she was willing to give. She was never supposed to be queen. She was simply always ready to be one. Like this video. Share this series with someone who thinks royal history is just dates and portraits. And subscribe to Chronicles of the Crown, because this channel exists for stories exactly like this one. Stories that the history books flatten into something manageable. She was not manageable. And neither is the truth. This is Chronicles of the Crown. We will see you in the next one.